The great hall of Iron Peak was cold that October evening, even with every hearth burning. Seraphine Ashwood stood near the back of the assembly, her hands folded quietly at her sides, her eyes fixed on a point just above the stone floor. She already knew what the night would bring. She had stood in this same spot for 3 years running, and the result had never changed. The seasonal strength assessment was a tradition as old as the pack itself. Every member was called forward, evaluated, and ranked. Seraphine had been last each time. She had carried that ranking home alone each time, set it down somewhere private inside herself, and moved on. That was what she did. She moved on. What she did not expect was that this year, Alpha Callum Voss would not simply note her result and continue. He had guests that evening, 2 visiting alphas from a pack in the east, broad-shouldered men with watchful eyes who had come to discuss a trade arrangement. They sat at the high table with cups of dark tea and the ease of men who were accustomed to being the most important people in any room. Callum sat between them, and Seraphine noticed, before her name was even called, that he was performing. Every word, every pause was calibrated for their attention. When she walked forward, he watched her the way a person watches something they have already decided about. He asked her to shift. She did, slowly, her wolf form smaller than any beta in the room, and quieter than most. She stood under the hall lanterns for 10 seconds, while everyone observed her in silence. Then she shifted back and waited. Callum set down his cup, stood, and walked a slow circle around her. Then he turned to his guests with the confidence of a man making a point he had made many times before. He said she was exactly what an Omega should never be. Weak in body, weak in bloodline, weak in every sense the word carried. He said he kept her because the old codes required it, and for nothing more. The hall was very quiet. Seraphine looked at him for 3 full seconds. She counted them, later, when she was alone. 3 seconds of holding his gaze before she lowered her eyes, because fighting in that room would have cost her everything, and given her nothing. The visiting alphas laughed. Callum nodded, satisfied. The assessment continued. She walked home alone. That night she sat on the floor of her small cabin, with her knees pulled to her chest, and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had been done to her. She did not rush past the moment. She had learned it was better to feel things completely in private than to carry them half-felt for months. She cried for a while. Then she washed her face and went to bed. In the days that followed, she noticed something she could not explain. A mark beneath her collarbone, faint as a watercolor brushstroke, had been there since birth. She had always assumed it was a simple birthmark. Now it was warm for the first time in her memory, pulsing gently like a second heartbeat, most strongly when she faced the forest beyond the pack's northern border. She told no one. She was accustomed to carrying things alone. 2 weeks after the assembly, a border dispute arose with a neighboring pack over an old territorial line that both sides read differently. Seraphine had spent years quietly reading the pack's archived treaties, and she located a clause in a covenant signed 80 years prior that resolved the matter cleanly. She wrote it up in 3 careful pages and brought it to Callum. He read 2 sentences. He handed it back. He told her, in front of his entire Beta Council, that he did not accept strategic counsel from Omegas. Their role was to support the pack, not to direct it. 3 days later, he used her solution in the negotiation. He presented it as his own research. The dispute was resolved, and he received commendation from both packs, and her name was not mentioned once. Something settled in Seraphine then. Not rage, though the anger was there underneath, quiet and entirely justified. What settled was a cold, clean clarity. She had been waiting, without fully admitting it, for recognition from a man who had decided what she was, before he ever looked. She understood now that this waiting was a form of handing him power she had never agreed to give. She stopped waiting. Around this same time, the northern edge of the pack's territory began to behave strangely. Animals assembled at the tree line each evening, standing as if marking a boundary of their own. 2 Beta Scouts returned from a patrol disoriented, unable to account for 3 missing hours. Callum called it seasonal disruption and planned to send fighters in at dawn to establish dominance over whatever was causing it. Seraphine felt the mark on her chest burn warmer each day and said nothing. On the 21st night since the assembly, she rose at 2 in the morning, dressed, and walked into the forest. She did not fully decide to go. It was more accurate to say she stopped resisting a pull that had been building for weeks. The mark was steady and certain, and she followed it the way you follow a sound you cannot yet name, but know matters. The forest at night was enormous and old. Moonlight fell through the canopy in long silver stripes across the frost. She walked for 40 minutes without a path, and she was not afraid. She noticed this with some surprise. She arrived at a clearing that was a perfect circle, centered on a single ancient stone engraved with symbols she recognized from the oldest treaty in the pack's archive, the one so fragile she had handled it with gloves. She had not understood those symbols when she read them then. Standing before the stone now, she understood she was about to. She knelt and placed her palm against the engravings. The light from the mark passed briefly through her skin, visible for just a moment, like a candle seen through a closed hand. Then the wolf came. It emerged from the far edge of the clearing, white, not gray-white or cream, but the white of new snowfall on still water, a white that seemed to carry its own light. It was enormous, larger than any shifted alpha she had seen, with eyes the pale silver of ice over deep water. It moved without sound. The frost did not crack beneath its paws. Every instinct she had ever been taught told her to lower her gaze, to make herself small, to demonstrate submission to something so far beyond her in power. She did none of these things. It was not defiance. It was something older, something that lived in the part of her that had endured the Great Hall and the returned document and the erased name, and had not broken. She met the wolf's eyes, and her hands were steady. The wolf crossed the clearing and stopped 3 feet from her. It read her. She felt it as a tangible thing, a presence moving through her history the way light moves through water, touching everything without forcing anything. She felt it find every assembly, every silence, every small erasure, and she did not look away. Then the sacred white wolf bowed. Slowly, with the full weight of something that chose its actions deliberately, it lowered its great head until its chin nearly touched the frozen ground. It held the position for 7 seconds. The engravings on the ancient stone filled with gold light. Then the wolf raised its head, held her gaze 1 moment longer, and walked back into the trees without a sound. Seraphine knelt in the frost for a long time after it was gone. She was shaking, not from cold. She did not have a name for what she was feeling, and she decided not to look for one. She let it be large and unnamed, and entirely real. In the days that followed, she wrote to an elderly woman named Oren, in a neighboring territory, who was known for keeping the old histories that Pax had stopped teaching. Oren replied with pages of careful handwritten notes about the Veilborn. The Veilborn were not Omegas in the modern diminished sense. They were a covenant class, marked at birth, chosen to serve as bridge keepers between the living pack and the sacred wild. In the old world, they had been among the most respected members of any pack. The modern hierarchy had erased them so thoroughly that most packs had no record they had ever existed. The sacred white wolf did not appear to alphas. It appeared to the Veilborn, and only when something important needed witnessing. Seraphine read this at her desk with Oren's pages spread before her, and she allowed herself, fully and without qualification, to understand that she had never been what she was told she was. 3 days later, the northern forest went wrong. Not in a way that could be answered with force. The trees beyond the boundary became dense in ways that had not been true the day before. The 2 scouts returned from a patrol with hours of memory missing. Animals refused to enter the area. Something ancient and patient was pressing against the edge of the territory, not as an attack but as a test. The sacred wild was conducting a boundary check, measuring whether Iron Peak still honored the covenant between wolfkind and the land. The proper response was recognition, not strength. Callum assembled his fighters and planned to send them in at dawn. Seraphine asked for a private meeting that evening. He granted it with visible impatience. She told him everything, calmly and clearly, with Oren's notes laid on the table between them. She showed him the covenant mark. She explained the Veilborn. She told him that sending fighters into that forest would be read as aggression, and the consequences could be permanent. He told her she was confused. He told her the mark was a birth defect. He told her to go home. She went home. And before dawn, while the fighters assembled, she walked to the northern border alone. At the boundary, where the wrongness in the forest was thickest, she stood still and spoke the covenant words from Oren's notes, in the old language the pack no longer used, low and steady. She did not perform the words, she simply meant them. The forest listened. The compression in the air softened. The density eased the way a held breath releases. The ancient wild could not be impressed by strength. It recognized only what was genuine, and what was genuine in Seraphine had always been there, whether or not anyone had bothered to look. By the time Callum arrived at the tree line with his fighters behind him, it was over. The wrongness was gone. The scouts who re-entered found their missing hours restored. The boundary was stable. He found Seraphine already standing at the border, the last of the gold light fading slowly from her collarbone. He had no words ready. She said nothing to help him. Then the white wolf walked out of the forest. In daylight, in full view of 30 witnesses. It crossed the open ground between the trees and Seraphine, and every wolf present felt the weight of the moment settle over them. This was something that did not belong to the pack hierarchy, and did not answer to it. It had chosen this moment and this audience deliberately, and it moved through the silence without any hurry at all. It stopped before Seraphine, and it bowed. Lower than it had bowed in the clearing by moonlight, its chest touched the frost-hardened earth. It held the position for 10 full seconds. Callum Voss did not move. Something in his face was very still, in a way that was different from his usual stillness of control. This was the stillness of a man whose entire framework for the world was being quietly, thoroughly dismantled in front of witnesses he could not dismiss. The white wolf raised its head, held Seraphine's gaze one final time, and walked back into the trees without once looking at anyone else. The silence held for a long moment. Then, one by one, the betas knelt. Not in submission, in recognition. The old stories they had learned as children, and set aside as adults, had just walked out of the ancient forest, and bowed before the woman their alpha had publicly called weak, 6 weeks ago. Callum walked toward her and stopped a few feet away. He searched for words and could not find the right ones. She watched him search without helping. She was done making things easier for him than they deserved to be. She told him she had been in Iron Peak for 10 years, and had never once asked him to believe in her. All she had ever needed was for him to stop deciding what she was before he looked. She said he could take all the time he needed to learn the difference, but she would not be making herself smaller while he did. She walked back toward the compound without looking back. In the weeks that followed, things changed in ways that were small but could not be reversed. The pack began reading the old histories. Orin came and stayed a month. Seraphine was given a seat at council, and the right to speak without being redirected. Callum returned the credit for the border treaty to her publicly, at a full pack assembly, stating her name clearly and without being prompted. It came months too late and could not undo what had been done, but she received it for what it was, a man beginning, imperfectly and belatedly, to correct something he could not uncorrect. On a night in late November, she walked back to the clearing alone. The frost was heavy, and the moon was full, and the ancient stone stood exactly as it had always stood. She knelt and placed her palm against the engravings. The mark beneath her collarbone pulsed once, warmly, like a greeting between two things that recognize each other. She stayed for a long time in the quiet of the clearing. When she finally rose and turned back toward the compound, her face was at peace. She had always known what she was. It had simply taken the world long enough to look.